Hello, everybody, and welcome back to part three of my three-part series on the Cultural Revolution then and now, where we're taking a look at Mao's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s and comparing it to the situation we find ourselves in today. So, in part one, we covered the historical background of the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, Mao's fall from power, and in part two, we dealt with the ideological underpinnings and what Mao thought he could accomplish by going through the Cultural Revolution. So, today we're finally going to get into what actually happened, how the Cultural Revolution was carried out, and the aftermath. And this is the part where we should really start to see a lot of comparisons to the situation that we're going in today. There were a number of problems in carrying out the Cultural Revolution. The first and most obvious being if Mao was going to purge pretty much everybody from the party, who could he trust? Because, I mean, the party basically had totalitarian control over China. So if you can't rely on any of the people under you, what are you going to do? Now, what Mao wound up doing is he looked to the army. In particular, his old comrade Lin Biao. They had an understanding between them that once the Cultural Revolution was finished and all of the enemies were destroyed, the army would step in and take power. Uh, and that's eventually what happened. To my understanding, several million people transitioned from the army into all the bureaucratic posts that had been made available because of all the purges. And China basically functioned as a junta until the end of Mao's regime, until he died, which is once again something that is very possible that we might see here, that the army might step in to restore some sort of order and take the place of the devastated middle and professional classes. So Mao had a plan for what was going to go happen once everything was over, but there was the question of how were they going to do this in the meantime? How was he going to take literally everybody down? Now, his idea was we're going to turn to somebody outside of the current political order. We're going to look outside of the party to something completely new. Now, within China, mass politics, to say the least, were not really encouraged. The people weren't supposed to take part in government. The Communist Party itself was fairly technocratic and was kind of like a cult devoted to the worship of Mao personally. In particular, students tend to be the most activist portion of the population. They tend to be the ones who are idealistic, who think they can change the world. They have education and they have all these ideas, but they're too young to really have any kind of power. And in particular, the most revolutionary tend to be the children of the elites. Ironically enough, the same elites that were about to be purged. So Mao started to make fiery speeches saying that the revolution had been betrayed, there were enemies everywhere. In order to achieve real equality, in order to deal with all these evil, intolerant, anti-egalitarians, the revolution needed to be made pure. You need to get rid of everything else that remained that could possibly taint it. They needed their pure society. Now, this should sound fairly familiar because it is. It's very kind of reminiscent of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, where the government basically takes a marginalized group outside of the political system and uses them as kind of the terror or the shock troopers to destroy all of its enemies. So as Mao made these speeches, groups of students egged on by him began to form that took the name the Red Guard. So they just started kind of engaging in an orgy of violence. So the fortunate thing, once again, about Mao's Cultural Revolution is it was literally everybody who was a target. I think the scientific and technical class was exempt because Mao needed them to build nukes and submarines, but pretty much everybody else was up for targeting. So the first group, I believe, was in Beijing, then Peking University, and they started beating up their professors, calling them counter-revolutionaries, burning Chinese books, attacking actors, journalists, that kind of thing. And Mao went and endorsed them and he allowed one of them to put a Red Guard armband on him, and he announced his unconditional support for the Red Guard movement. So, as I said, you have this class of people who has no political power, who has all this idealism and feels they kind of have everything to gain, and you give them basically absolute power, and you tell them you can do whatever you want. You can go on a rampage, you can riot, you can loot, you can kill all these people who you think have been screwing you, your teachers, your parents. Basically, you're just giving angsty teenagers a purpose. Angsty teenagers who are generally pretty bored and disengaged, absolute power, and you're telling them you have this mission. You have this mission to go build a just society. And in pursuit of that, you can do basically anything you want. And kind of the obvious comparison here is Antifa. So I've heard a couple different theories as to who makes up Antifa. Some of them are that it's the children of the wealthy and the elite who are kind of the leaders of it. And then you have the university professors and that kind of thing who make up parts of it. But you also have what Marx called the lumpen proletariat, or as I like to call the stealing class and the dealing class, like the dregs of society who jump on because they want revenge and they want free stuff. So these groups formed into the Red Guards, and once again, it started out with them attacking like the people that angsty teenagers don't like, and then it surged forward into an orgy of violence. So they started just killing authors or beating them to death. One of the things they did is they kidnapped a whole bunch of, I think it was all like the most prominent authors and actors in China in Peking, and they took them all and made them watch as they burned all their books and all the opera costumes and that kind of thing. So, like I said, they just kind of destroyed everything. I'm not sure if they destroyed Confucius's home or they just looted it and damaged it. But Mao really hated Confucius because of the whole his ethical and moral philosophies of governance were antithetical to what Mao believed in. So the Red Guards attacked Confucius's temple. I think something like 80% of the monuments in Beijing were destroyed. Obviously, the Forbidden City and like Tiananmen Square survived because they were useful for propaganda posters. But yeah, they more or less just started demolishing everything. It was, as in 1984, it was a purge of the middle class and the upper middle class. Basically, anybody who could form some sort of ideological opposition to Mao. The ones who weren't killed were sent to camps. A lot of the party officials, they had secret police who would go through everything they'd done for the last like 30 years since the revolution started. And those who were deemed loyal were rehabilitated and were allowed to regain their own old posts. And those who weren't were sent to work on farms or just killed or spent the rest of their lives in prison. I believe during this time period, Mao also said that like the concept of grades and tests were an imperialist counter-revolutionary invention. We actually saw this recently in California, where a professor refused to cancel exams for black students, and he got removed. I think he got sent on a forced leave of absence or something like that. And we are seeing kind of these things break down. And the police and army were told by Mao to just not do anything. Like they were told, stand down. We're going to have an narco tyranny now. Just let these guys burn cities. Let them just destroy everything in their path. They have the official stamp of approval of me. And I can't really say the establishment, but once again, it's very similar to what we're seeing now. You have these mobs of children of the elite combined with the dregs of society who've been given carte blanche to just do whatever they want. All of it ideologically justified with them building this paradise on earth. And it's, yeah, sounds pretty similar, doesn't it? And you have them lynching police officers. You have them, these massive denunciation campaigns. Part of Maoism was if what you were forced to do is denounce yourself. So you were forced to go out in public and give a speech about how much you sucked, and everybody around you would denounce you. And this was a way of raising their status and basically permanently destroying your good name and making you worthless. Now, some of the people who were really good at it, I guess, got rehabilitated and they were deemed to have learned their lesson. But this was kind of a critical aspect of Maoism was thought reform, even if they were going to kill the people at a later date. I think Maoism was really closer to the ideal that's expressed in 1984 than Stalinism or Nazism were, substantially closer. So as the orgy of violence descended, people didn't really have much else to do. During the Great Leap Forward, interestingly enough, from what I've read, the economy more or less continued on as to be expected. People still went to work, banks were still open, all that stuff was kind of going along. A lot of the remaining private wealth was stolen by the Red Guards. A lot of it was given to the party elite. A lot of the like works of art and rare books and that kind of thing that were taken by the Red Guard were taken by Mao and his cronies. One of the funny things about Mao, or one of the sinister things about him, was he was a great lover of books. Aside from swimming, his main hobby was reading in bed. He had specially designed beds so he could stack a bunch of books. He had huge bookshelves, and so all of the rare books that they found, they more or less gave to Mao, and he enjoyed reading them. And his wife really enjoyed movies, in particular Gone with the Wind. So they had this like huge stash of forbidden materials that they enjoyed, where it was denied for everyone else. So yeah, so all this stuff had been taken away, and so people didn't really have anything else to do other than, like I said, work and engage in political activism. So things kind of continued along. Mao allowed a civil war to develop within the Communist Party between the left and the moderates or conservatives. Keep in mind, the moderates or conservatives were also far left, but they weren't. They were more like, we need the country to function on a basic level, whereas Mao was like, no, we just need more revolution. So, as things kind of continued to spiral out of control, there eventually reached a point where Mao's political goals had more or less been achieved. He'd succeeded in destroying Chinese culture. He'd succeeded in purging literally all of his political opponents. They were all gone. And he was left with absolute power. And then you had the Red Guard who were like, what else is left? I don't know. And he was really scared that these guys were going to start turning on him because they literally had no one left to turn on and they were still rabid psychos. So this was the point where Mao declared an end to the Cultural Revolution, and using the army, he forcibly broke up the Red Guard and purged them. And most of them were scattered around the countryside, and they were sent to hard labor camps or peasant camps or that kind of thing. And the Red Guard was more or less demobilized. And to kind of take the place of everything that got destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, in terms of the party apparatus, the military moved in, and we had a de facto military junta. Now, Lin Biao would eventually fall from power, and he would try to flee to the Soviet Union after attempting a coup d'etat. And with his death, there was literally no one who had anywhere near the amount of influence Mao had over the government. So Mao had achieved basically everything he had set out to achieve. But in a lot of ways, it was a Pyrrhic victory, because at the end of the day, human beings are still human beings. And we need self actualization. We need things like stories, we need plays, we need recreation. During the Cultural Revolution, they had even killed horticulturalists. Flowers were banned as bourgeoisie, any kind of decoration or that sort of thing. And these are things that developed in every culture. This is part of the way we understand ourselves as human beings. And Mao had completely and totally removed all of these. There was also the issue that Mao was extremely old at this point in time, and he wouldn't really have long to enjoy this. So it was like, who's left? Um, Things were obviously not going to survive him because everybody, like, nobody wanted the Cultural Revolution really, aside from the Red Guards. Nobody wanted it continued. People wanted, like, entertainment to come back, people wanted recreation to come back. People were tired of Mao diverting all the state resources into into building nuclear weapons and other stuff China couldn't afford. And when Deng finally took power, the first things he did was he brought back a lot of novels and movies and stuff like that. He brought back a lot of forms of recreation, and he also shifted the focus. Keep in mind, under Mao, there wasn't really even a normal schooling system. During the Cultural Revolution, they actually shut down all the schools, so the Red Guards would have more time to carry out their activism and that sort of thing. So they shifted towards that, towards infrastructure, towards the actual things that make a country go. Because there's only so long that, like, idealism and radicalism can sustain itself before you start to see significant pushback on the other direction. You can't fight the tide forever. No one can change human nature. You can make people better or make people worse, but they're still better or worse humans. They were never going to be the worker bees that Mao wanted them to be. And as I said, nobody wanted to destroy Chinese culture except for him. So what he was kind of left with at this point in time was he needed a successor. Now the obvious successor was Chou Lai, but the problem with that is Mao had used him as his tool for like the last 30 years or so, and Mao was an incredibly spiteful person, and the idea of Chow seizing power and outliving him really made him angry. So Chow had, I think it was pancreatic cancer or something. It was a very easily treatable form of cancer. So Mao deliberately withheld treatment from Chow until the last possible minute, and then allowed them to do like a half-assed operation. And the goal was to that Chow would die before him, so he wouldn't be a successor, and he wouldn't finally get to step out of Mao's shadow. So Chow wound up dying before him. And then the question is, who's literally left to take his place? And Mao established the Gang of Four, which included his wife and some of the Mao's cronies. But once again, no one liked these people. People really hated Madame Mao because she had been in charge of the secret, basically the Cultural Revolution, and destroying everything. She was also an absolutely horrendous person. Mao kind of used her as his attack dog because literally everybody hated her, including Mao, but it meant that she was entirely dependent upon him politically, so it was pretty much impossible for her to ever really turn on him. So the only real person he had left, ironically enough, was Deng Xiaoping, who he had purged but was still alive and was really the only person competent enough to run the country. So Deng came back and he almost immediately started undoing the Cultural Revolution. And Mao was kind of so old and feeble at this point, he was barely functional anymore. And he more or less had to watch Deng start to overturn everything he had done. They started restoring aspects of a market economy, what would eventually become socialism with Chinese characteristics, and things were getting like a lot better. And Mao spent his last days as kind of a broken man, obsessed with his failures. China hadn't become a superpower, he hadn't become the leader of the third world. His legacy was going to be completely ignored and forgotten. While Mao is still a big figure in China, Maoist ideology was more or less kind of thrown out. I'd say the Communist Party of China stopped being kind of a far left party or a communist party and is basically just a third positionist party at this point in time. Um, it's very much more Deng Xiaoping's party, and I guess you could call it a left wing nationalist party rather than Mao's party. Because Mao was once again a globalist, and he had invited a lot of African students. And he probably would have allowed immigration from the third world, but Maoist China was substantially poorer than countries like Somalia, so no one wanted to move to Maoist China. And that kind of brings us to a conclusion of the Cultural Revolution then. So, what can we learn from this? Because, like I said, we're kind of in the middle phase of this. We're just at the phase where Mao's unleashing the Red Guards, and they haven't even really started to turn against the party officials yet. So, is this what we're going to see? Is Black Lives Matter going to start purging the Democratic Party? Are we going to see like people like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi be overthrown? Are we going to see some sort of internal coup by the Democratic Socialists of America? Or some other more radical figures? Or are we going to see kind of a once all the rightist groups and the enemies of the oligarchs are destroyed, we're going to see some sort of military junta seize power or a mass purge of Antifa as they're no longer politically useful. And these are kind of some of the possibilities that we have. Are the more pragmatic faction going to take power? I don't really know, but I definitely think there's a lot of similarities here in terms of the goals of seizing absolute power, of destroying the past in order that a new past can be created, the breakdown of law and order, the tacit government support for anarchy. And these are all things we're seeing now. So, once again, I don't know how this is going to play out because there's not a clear leader of it. There's a class that leads it, but whether or not these forces they've unleashed are going to turn upon them or there's going to be some sort of counter reaction, we don't really know yet. So I hope you enjoyed this series. I've been working on it for quite a while. I reread Mao the Untold Story. I watched some documentaries. And I just took some time to kind of like come up with a structure to this and how we're going to deal with it. Because I think it's very important and I think it's something that's very topical. And I do really enjoy Chinese history, particularly modern Chinese history. And this was a time period I really didn't know much about, and I was kind of happy to learn about it. So I hope you enjoyed this series, like I said. God bless, and lots more content to come.